Okay, thank you very much everyone for joining me. I'm not going to make a real introduction, just say a few words at the very beginning, and after that, for a technical problem, I will not be able to speak, so I will interact only via text chat. We are here to discuss the breakthrough that was announced a couple of weeks ago by the Brain Preservation Foundation and Robert McIntyre's company Nectome. The breakthrough was that the Brain Preservation Prize has been finally won. Let me navigate back to where I was. They have produced some very nice image of a preserved brain. And here the hope is that sooner or later some developments in the technology will be able to preserve very accurately an entire human connectome for mind uploading when the technology of mind uploading will arrive. In fact, as Ken said in a very nice video, this ASC cryopreservation is really a form of cryonics for uploaders, for those who want their mind uploaded in the future. Well, I can't not to show here this beautiful picture of Fred and Linda Chamberlain, where Fred is wearing a t-shirt that says mind uploading is the ultimate out-of-body experience. Fred is not with us today because he has a temporary problem. There is a Linda Chamberlain and other people from Alcor. This business of showing things while changing the slide is very complicated. Yeah, I'm showing you this picture where Linda is hugging a Fred in a cryonic container to remind all of us that we are talking of some nice technology here, but we are also talking of real human beings, and we should really always keep in mind that. And finally, we should, of course, remember Robert Ettinger and think that now we can see the prospect of immortality a bit closer. Now, I am not going to speak after this moment because of technical issues. So since I'm speaking only now, I would like to say first what my questions are going to be. And I think I interpret the feelings of many people watching this video, asking as first question, when the fuck can this be available to me? To me, myself. Don't forget that I'm 60 years old. What does that mean? We would like to know realistically when ASC could be offered legally to patients before death. I think the answer to that question is it could be done right now with some preparation. But then we also have a question, when could ASC be legally offered before death? Oh, I think the one before. When could ASC be offered before death? In the US, or perhaps in some other nations that have been allowing doctor-assisted death for some more time, I believe the regulations in some other countries could be more friendly than in the US, and that's something I would really like to know. there is the problem of cost. What can be done to bring the cost down? In these connections, it would be interesting to know what's the status of research on chemical fixation for room temperature storage, meaning keeping the brain at room temperature for centuries. And then, since we are comparing different technologies here, we have seen a demonstration that ASC, or vitrifixation, can preserve a connectome with high quality, and I guess what the experts are now thinking is that this quality is better than what it could be obtained by vitrification alone. But the question remains, could vitrification alone be already good enough and preserve the connectome with a quality suitable for future uploading? These are the questions that I have in mind. Now I'm going to stop speaking and just listen to you guys. If I have something to say, I will use the text chat. And I would like to give the floor first to Ken Hayworth and then to Max More to explain more to us. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ken. Yes, we can.
Well, thanks. Can people hear me? I'm going to assume the answer is yes, because there's
yes.
Great. Thanks, Giulio, for inviting me here. I think that the most that I want to say is that first of all, I am not associated with Nectome. I have no real inside knowledge or control over what has occurred. I don't know exactly what they're planning on doing next. I have asked Robert details of what he's done so far, and have looked over his website and has made sure that a lot of the things that were said in the press were wrong. So just to be very clear from my perspective, ASC is a very promising technology that looks like it can preserve the connectome. I think it should be developed into a something that could be applied both post-mortem and pre-mortem. I think that there should be a publication on that, presumably by Robert, but by anybody that would push this forward. And there should be a rousing debate within the neuroscience and medical community about whether this should be applied. And I don't think anybody should be talking about applying this to humans anytime soon. I don't think that anybody should be wondering who's going to do it first or how much it's going to cost or things like that, because really this is a preliminary medical development. And I guess I would put it in the context of if there was a researcher that had just shown promising results from a new cancer therapy on mice, it would be a distraction and a terrible thing to have everybody saying, give me the drug now because I'm dying. There are ways that these things are done in the rest of the medical community, and I think that ASC should be applied in the same manner. There should be a debate, more publications, and if my perfect world had occurred, which it hasn't, Robert would have stayed at 21st Century Medicine, would have had the fantastic facilities that the 21st Century Medicine had that allowed the prize to be won in the first place, and that team that developed ASC would have continued its development and published a few more papers by this time. That was what I was kind of expecting, and to me, it's a little sad that that this is even has to be done as a separate company, and the idea that that Nectome has gotten a bunch of what I consider to be atrocious press this week. It makes me feel somewhat sad, but I put this in perspective that as far as I know, and I'm not a spokesman for Nectome, I don't work for Nectome, I have no ability to control what they're doing, but as far as I understand, they have not applied this to a human being in any type of except for anatomical donation, which obviously does not count. They have not sold this as a service that has any type of promise for it to be applied. According to their website, from what I've read, they're planning on doing a lot of experiments over the next 2 years, at least. Again, according to their website and according to their timeline, they're planning on publishing those results. And it looks like what they're doing is essentially what any other company would do that has a radical medical technology that they're developing. They're going through and playing by the rules. And I think it is very unhelpful for anybody to try to push them, or I'd have to say threaten them, because I feel like your potential Vice article is coming across to me as almost a threat. It's a threat to Nectome to develop this and apply it to human being. It's a threat to Alcor to say, "Oh, you better do it as well, or else somebody's going to apply this in some other country." And I would ask you to first of all question: do you really want to throw some gasoline on the fire here with that Vice article? I think you should ask yourself that question. But for the long run, I really think that everybody should just take a step back and let this progress the way any other medical technology would. And maybe I should, at that point, give up the floor for Max.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Can everybody hear me?
Is there some magic way to turn up the volume?
Yes, if you go to the little speaker icon at the top right, you can increase or decrease the voice as compared to ambient sounds. So you came in very loud, and I turned yours down, whereas Julio was pretty quiet. So you can just the voice.
Oh,
the top right
fantastic!
Speaker.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We can hear you here, Max.
Okay. I would stand, but every time I do it, I'm facing the wrong way, and I can't figure out how to turn around. So I guess I'll just sit. Okay, and I'll just disappear behind the wall again. I haven't used this thing in ages. Let me just get where I can see people. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate what you say there, Ken. it's already pretty messy for Cryonics as it is legally. And by the way, a bit of very recent news for those who haven't heard. In England, Cryonics UK has apparently had their charitable status revoked following some bad publicity of a Cryonics Institute case. So, and we're always concerned about how we're treated in this country. So I think we want to be very careful about the claims we make. And to some extent, I disagree with Ken in terms of the ethics of offering a service that's not proven, because I think in a sense we can't prove any of these things until, in the final sense, until we can actually revive people. We can make very strong plausibility arguments. We can provide proof that we are preserving neural structures, but to say that we're going to offer a service where we will revive people without any qualifications, obviously we're still relying on advances that haven't happened yet. So I think that'll be true of both cryonics and vitrification, if I'm saying that correctly. I think that doesn't mean you can't provide the service so long as you make those uncertainties clear, as we do in our paperwork. There are pages and pages of disclaimers about what could go wrong. We show good CT scans, we show very bad CT scans, we make it very clear that there are no real promises involved here. A couple of things about ASC. Though our position statement probably sounds more contrary to ASC than I might have put it exactly, we could, if we had evidence that this was going to do at least as good a job as current cryopreservation methods of vitrification, we could certainly offer that service. In fact, we'd be well set up to do that, because a lot of the discussion seems to have ignored the fact that it's actually going to be very difficult to do this well. It's not just, we just pump in some chemicals and you sit on a shelf and that's it, and it's a lot cheaper. It doesn't work that way. You need to have a team ready to go. You need a standby team, the same as in cryonics. You need to act very quickly if you're going to get preservation done properly. Even if you need less storage costs, there will be some, because you're going to keep that person, that brain secure. I think there's also, the actual cost of storing a brain, Alcor, is a minority of the payment. So it's 25,000 out of the 80,000. And I should also note that this idea that there's virtually no cost to it. Also, apart from the standby costs, the storage costs, security costs, you've got to think about the other end. If you're going to say there's some reasonable chance we can revive someone in the future, you have to ask, well, what is that going to cost and who's going to pay for it? Very frequently when people criticize the cryonics, they say, not understanding how it works, at least at Alcor, they say, well, why would society in the future want to bring you back? Why will spend their resources to do that? Which, in the abstract, is a perfectly reasonable question. And I think it's quite reasonable when applied to certain other organizations that don't provide for that. Now, of course, at Alcor, the answer is, well, we're going to do it and we're going to pay for it. That's why we have a patient care trust fund. And that's why we limit the draw on that to 2%, because over the very long run, we should be able to do a bit better than that. So that's our absolute maximum draw, 2%. The idea being that over time that money should grow and actually be able to pay for revival procedures. Now, those revival procedures could involve, and this is our conservative base scenario, bringing you back in your biologically identical body, either if you're already a whole body, restoring the whole thing, or if you take the neuropreservation option, as I always have, regenerating a body from your own DNA, so it is basically your body. Or you could do what the uploaders want to do, which is to scan the brain and produce an uploaded version of yourself. And I know that would be Linda's preference. My own preference right now is that, even though I'm pretty sure that uploaded me would be me, in fact, I spent a lot of my PhD dissertation discussing that, I'm pretty sure of that. I would still prefer to come back biologically and then make my choices from that point. But it does offer both approaches. But I do want to stress that any discussion of, and Ken says we shouldn't even be talking about costs. Well, if people are going to talk about costs, let's do it in a realistic way. Thinking about standby costs, I mean, I've heard discussions of offering this as a pre-mortem procedure, which I just don't see how it's going to work right now, given that, and this may not be universally true, but in some jurisdictions that are now allow people to terminate their life as it's currently defined by self-administration, well, that's only going to help if you are able to move. So if you're paralyzed, if you have all kinds of conditions that mean you can't move and can't self-administer, it's still not going to work. Also, I think in some jurisdictions there is a list of substances that can be used, or it may be left up to the doctor's discretion. I'm not sure using aldehyde would be one of those. So that could be a problem in doing it pre-mortem. In general, the idea of whether it's cryonics or vitrification, doing it pre-mortem, of course, isn't ideal. It's something we'd like to be able to do it ourselves, because you can choose exactly when to go. You can be sure that the team will be there and ready, and you can start the procedure while your brain is still intact. So I think, whichever method we're using, ASC or cryonics or vitrification, that's obviously where you want to do it if possible. So those are my main points, really. I really just think I'm not really going to address it technically very much, except to say that I think, well, aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation produces clearer images than current methods of vitrification without fixation. It does so, this is from the position statement, does so at the expense of being toxic to the biochemical machinery of life. It also makes it harder to reverse, but that's, if we have really advanced nanotechnology, that's not impossible. It may not be completely irreversible, but it's certainly harder to reverse than just through vitrification. Also, if you don't have ideal conditions, you may be making things worse, because fixation increases freezing damage if cryoprotectant penetration is inadequate. So you really have to do this under really excellent conditions, which may be limited to elective procedures done while you're still legally alive.
Max, could you send me a reference on that? I've heard that, but I've never actually seen proof that fixation causes worse damage from ice. I don't know. And if you could you expand on that? Why would it?
Like I said, I'm not really the technical expert on that, but I know, Greg and Brian, I can get to draw on all of that, and I can give you a reference on it.
Let me argue against that for a second, if I can. And I'm not an expert on it as well. I'm really putting out my ignorance, maybe, so that people can correct me, which this might be a good crowd to correct me. The way I look at it is that because glutaraldehyde and presumably other aldehydes, if you wanted to speed up the procedure, because it stabilizes the brain for long periods of time at room temperature, you can afford to perfuse cryoprotectant agent in over days if you need it to. And therefore, you should not have any concerns about ice crystal formation because of that extended length of time that you have to ramp up the cryoprotectant concentration. Am I missing something, or?
Well, there's a lot that I don't know about this. I don't know how long does it take to get the aldehyde into all parts of the brain. How much is being fixed? Is there still some degradation going on? Obviously, I think you and I are both agreed that just preserving the connectome is not sufficient. You've got all kinds of things going on inside the neurons that you have to also protect. I don't know whether all of that's being fixed or how quickly.
I think that the connectome is enough. I know that the BPF statement doesn't say so, but I am a minority of the BPF, so.
Okay, I thought I'd read you say something to the contrary, but maybe that was BPF statement. Okay.
I think the connectome is enough.
Okay. Yeah, there seems to be a lot of expert opinion that suggests that there are things going on inside the neuron that also need to be preserved. Not the levels of not the levels of neurotransmitters, because those are actually determined by the physical structures, and you can bring that back. That doesn't matter if those are washed out. But there may be internal structures that many experts seem to think are probably necessary, although we still don't have a full understanding of how that works exactly.
Yeah, so, I'm glad that I don't have to have too much of an opinion on that, because ASC avoids ASC preserves a lot more than the connectome, as you know.
Yeah. So really, because I have nothing against ASC in principle. I just think there are obviously some problems in doing this well, and some severe limitations, and I think general context of cost and practicality have not been really properly addressed. And it's really a matter of comparing the quality of the preservation which I don't, I think Ken, you're right. We need more publications on this. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to go ahead and offer a service with very strong qualifications, because otherwise, you give the analogy of a cancer drug that's been tested on an animal and seemed to maybe work. Well, in my view is yes, someone should be able to use that. I mean, if the alternative is death, for certain death, then yes, you should be able to use something as long as it's understood that, look, we only tested this on one strain of rat, one time, and we really have no idea if it's going to work. Well, if the alternative is I'm dead, then yes, I'm gonna give that a shot. So I think as long as people have informed consent, that really isn't a problem. I think the practice has to be separated from the scientific approach, where you obviously do have to be very cautious. You have to take things step by step, and you have to publish. And we do want to see a lot more of that. And I know that 21CM is going to be publishing more, actually a paper on Steve Cole's brain that was actually done under unusual conditions, where we extracted the brain and apparently got extremely good results. And we'll also be adopting the blood-brain barrier opening technology, so that hopefully in the very near future we'll be able to produce kind of beautiful images that Robert produced, because there's a big difference between being able to show that you're preserving things and preserving things. So it may be that even though the brain's dehydrating and it's hard to get good images from electron microscopy, it's probably in very good shape. But once we're able to reduce the brain dehydration, I hope we can show them the same results that Robert did. And then, other factors will be important at that point.
Yeah, I've talked to Greg a little bit about that. I'm very excited to see how those studies go.
Yeah. We actually, when we did that, we'd never done it before. We had a pathologist come out to help us extract the brain. There's a good reason why we usually leave it in the skull. It's a good protective mechanism, and it turns out that a cryoprotected brain is harder to remove than a normal one. There's all kinds of things like 11 layers of tissue between the brain and the skull. But even so, even though we didn't really know what we were doing and we were on the phone to Greg as we were doing it, apparently the results were excellent, and the samples that we got, he's very excited about publishing that work. And we've already had one or two other people who don't have sufficient funding basically volunteering to be research subjects for more of that. So it's possible we'll have other examples too.
Could I ask what type of I've been putting forward kind of a what I would like to see ASC evolve into, and one of the things that I think that should be part of any ASC procedure that would be offered to human beings is a complete understanding on a case-by-case basis of how much damage there is. And this is one of the things that I've really been on Robert's case of developing such a protocol. The steps that Alcor has started using, if I understand it correctly, with CT scans, etc. That's one step. There's also the possibility of biopsies. There's also the possibility of I don't know, a whole bunch of things. Is there a protocol that could, from a cryonics point of view, be applied on a case-by-case basis, where you really get a complete understanding of how well a procedure went and how much of the brain, how much damage there is across the entire brain?
Well, it's very difficult to do in all cases. First of all, even with the CT scans, we can generally only do that with neuro patients, because we want to do this at liquid nitrogen temperature, and whole body patients generally don't fit the scanner. There's a couple of exceptions. We had some smaller people we could just about get through there, so we're already kind of limited in that respect. Now, doing biopsies, that becomes very controversial. I'm actually very strongly in favor of that, as I know as Dr. Harris, our medical advisor, and that's exactly what we did in the case of Steve Cole's, and that's why we were able to do all kinds of different testing. I forget, there's like 3 different kinds of testing that have been done in a way that we normally can't do. And we've talked about this before. We've already made CT scanning the default, so people now have to opt out if they don't want to be CT scanned. If we were to go to the next stage, which I would like to try to do, I'm sure we get a lot of members yelling at us, don't you dare touch my brain. But if you do it right, there's no real damage done. This is commonly done in brain surgery. They'll take a little biopsy of an area that's not going to affect anything. So that would be one way of getting more regularly results. The CT scan does tell us quite a bit. It shows us how well we've perfused the brain, which is obviously a very important part of the answer of how well we've done. To get biopsies would tell us, more indeed. So that's something that I think we're slowly moving toward, and it's going to be controversial. If we were to make that a default, we may have to make it an opt-in first of all, and then maybe later it would be an opt-out. But I think if we just make it opt-out right now, people will get probably be very upset with us. But from a research point of view, obviously, it would be very helpful.
And when that would be done would be at what point during the procedure?
I presume that will be done. I mean, we standardly drill burr holes to watch the surface of the brain, and we now have a new gadget that Steve Graeber designed that basically uses a laser with very high accuracy to measure retraction of the brain, so we can measure the level of dehydration. So I would imagine that you would do that when you do the burr holes, which is basically when we're setting up, when the surgery is going on. You can do this pretty much at the same time to access to cannulate the carotids. If you've drilled in the right spot, you could then take a small sample at that point. So it will be sort of during the process and shouldn't really interfere with it. Shouldn't take long at all.
The reason why I'm asking is that if it happens too early in the process, there might be damage that occurs later that is not seen. Along those lines, what is the current practice in terms of temperature of storage? I know that I read an article by Brian Walk a little while back that talked about intermediate temperature storage at Alcor. Is that being moved toward the standard?
I wouldn't say to the standard, but it's still, I don't know why, but it's still not quite on offer. But I think we're now very close to being able to do that. I think basically we know where we can get units that will support intermediate temperature storage. There still seems to be some disagreement over what the ideal temperature is. In our existing units, we have -140. Some people argue for -130 or -125. I think we're pretty close to offering that for neuro members. Whole body intermediate temperature storage would be more difficult, although internally we're working on designs for that make it affordable. Personally, I'm not that, although I think we should pursue this because we should make all these options available as long as they are options, because it will be a lot more expensive. I'm personally not that concerned about fracturing. I think we actually get rather little fracturing in the brain. If I understand Greg's work correctly, it's kind of pleasantly surprising that there are far more fractures happening in other organs. The brain actually seems to do pretty well. But even if there are macroscopic fraction, if there's any fracturing on a macroscopic level, I'm not that concerned about it because it's rather like, you cut your arm, your body can heal itself. What I'm worried about is the microscale damage. This kind of macroscale cracking shouldn't be too much of an issue, although it may occur at other levels that are of more concern. Again, I'm not really an expert on that area. So it's something that I believe we should be offering. We're moving towards doing so. And I hope that, at least for neuro members, it will be available sometime before the end of this year. What the cost will be, I don't know. I think the current system costs about 2.5 times as much for the storage aspect. Since a minimum is for the patient care trust fund for a regular neuro is 25,000, that will give you some idea. 2.5 times that, unless we can bring those costs down. So, just short answer to that is yes. I think we will be offering it for neuro patients in the near future. I don't want it to be compulsory. I want that to be optional. Okay, I'm just scanning through the comments in the chat window. So, Robin, were you going to say something? I was kind of reading as I was listening there.
Hello, can anyone hear me? Great. If Max, if you wanted to finish what you were saying, then I'm happy to let you finish your thought if you were trying to finish a thought. If not, let me just try to frame this in an economist terms. So far this industry actually is really small industry. There aren't very many customers so far, and so there aren't very many suppliers, and the suppliers have to deal with a relatively small amount of revenue. So this new procedure obviously is an exciting opportunity. But
hello, is anybody speaking?
This is Robin. Can anyone hear Max speaking? Max, can you hear me? Anyway, we can hear you, Max, and I guess you can't hear us. And I guess Max needs to turn on his speaker or something. As I was saying, this new procedure is expensive, at least initially, and so I can definitely understand why the existing suppliers who are, barely able to stay in business with their existing customers would be reluctant to, jump in quickly with paying a lot of cost to offer this new service, and so we'll have to see over time how the cost of this new option falls, and to what extent it can be validated, etc. I would just like to suggest we break this out in terms of cost and value. It looks obvious that one of the big issues here is that in the customer base here of people willing to do something like this, some of them are really big on expecting a sort of direct biological revival, and others are okay with some sort of a uploading brain emulation revival, and that somewhat splits this customer base. And since, for example, Alcor has a lot of customers in the first category, they would upset those customers if they were offering a product mainly that didn't offer that. And therefore, they would have to continue to offer something like that, and then offering a different technology as well would be expensive, given they have a limited set of customers. So one thing I'd like to suggest, or I'd like to know, is there any sort of good marketing or customer survey here, breaking out customer demand, i.e. how much different people are willing to pay in terms of one axis is this direct biological revival versus uploading, and another axis is some sort of best procedure versus the sort of thing Ken's talking about at once, which is something like very solidly demonstrated in the medical literature, so that it follows a standard medical process of really demonstrating things before you offer them to customers. Those are from an economic point of view, the key question for these suppliers is, how much demand is there for these various options? If they go pay the extra cost, how many more customers will they get? And, that's my key question I want to offer, which is to think about this in terms of, these poor suppliers who so far have been, doing this heroic effort of supplying these products that very few people want. Is there a prospect for this new product to introduce a lot more customers such that the demand goes way up to pay for the extra cost, or do we have to wait until these costs come way down before this is a plausible thing to introduce, etc.? And now I'll just stop and let somebody else talk or read the comments.
Well, Rob, I didn't hear the first part of that. I didn't realize that when I was adjusting the volume, I turned off my own ability to hear anybody. So I just caught the end of that in terms of Do we know how many people will be willing to pay more for different procedures? I think the answer is really we don't. We don't have much of a clue on that. And that's probably, we've been planning to do a survey of the Alcor membership, so that's something we could certainly include in that survey to find out, obviously most relevantly for intermediate temperature storage, but for other possibilities. We really don't know. We just know that there are many members who are struggling right now just to pay minimums for the current procedure. But there are people who could afford more expensive procedures. It's certainly worth looking into. Perhaps we could actually set up a something wider than Alcor. Perhaps we could set up a survey online somewhere else and have people from organizations like Humanity Plus and other Cryonics groups also. We'd have to design that carefully, I think, but we could certainly do that.
So whoever explicitly said he didn't want us to have the usual philosophical argument over, choosing between the two, and I agree with him there, but I mean, we don't have to argue about it philosophically to say that this is a key issue in this choice here, and rather than argue about it philosophically, we should be talking about it economically or business-wise, i.e., can we figure out what the relative demand of customers are for these two kinds of products, and and can we so Ken just chatted, on chat saying, can we discuss costs? How can we discuss costs without a procedure? And obviously, yes, you have to have a more specific procedure before you can know the cost, but presumably is the prospect that the cost will be less than the cost of the existing procedure? Even if it is, then still I would think Alcor having to offer two procedures would be more expensive for them than the current offering just one procedure. Is that not true, Max?
I don't really see why that should be true. In fact, you could give us economies of scale if we actually gain people who don't want the current cryonics procedures but do want ASC. A lot of the same infrastructure is needed for the standby team. They might need some different skills, but you're still going to need those kind of capabilities. So if you can spread those over a larger number of members, it should have the opposite effect. It should actually be helpful for our costs, but it would depend on exactly what kind of skills were required and how much overlap.
Well, let me just say again, from my opinion, I think Cryonics has been offered for 40 years, and so nobody. It doesn't make sense to rehash arguments about whether it should be offered or not, or what publication standards or whatever. But ASC has not. It is a radically different product, and so I think that these can almost live apart from each other. And I would recommend them live apart from each other for the foreseeable future. It's almost like an experiment. If we tried to do cryonics over again and did it in a way where you really did try to convince the medical community to embrace it. It's a long shot. It's a long shot, and it may not work. But why not just sit back and let's see if it works? And the best way to do that is to essentially not try to combine the two in some sense.
Well, Ken, I think although I'm saying we could do this and it probably wouldn't cost more, I'm sort of inclined to your approach, at least until it's been well established. In a way, this ASC option helps cryonics in the sense that it makes us conservative. We're now the conservative option, right? Because doing
Absolutely.
ASC, basically requires that you buy, but now you have to buy into some philosophical assumptions about uploading, and so we become the conservative. So maybe that's a good thing from our point of view.
But as a customer, I have to worry that if ASC is a separate thing, it has to be offered by separate providers, and they have to get separate funding and a separate set of customers and revenue and development. I mean, what if that doesn't happen and then we don't? I mean, as Julius, he's worried. Like we've always been worried about that we don't get it soon. I'm worried we don't ever get it. What's the?
So the answer to that is to hold those people's feet to the fire that actually have the are walking along that path of doing the publications, and so I think it is perfectly it's perfectly legitimate to email Robert, for example, every once in a while and say, Robert, what's taking you so long? People are very interested in this happening. Or, if if Alcor, for example, wanted to go along the same path, have lots of animal experiments, and to understand exactly the intricacies of glutaraldehyde perfusion under different medically relevant circumstances, understand the storage differences that occur with the glutaraldehyde perfused ASC preserved brain. If they wanted to, or any other organization wanted to walk along that line that involved medical publications and medical ethics debates, I think that's what we should be pushing. But we shouldn't be pushing anybody to say how much is it going to cost and when you're going to offer it. It's incredibly not helpful to do that. And the stories that dominated over the last couple of weeks, they were all stories that were how dare these people offer this, which it's not being offered. So I don't think it's just throwing fuel on the fire to start these debates on how much it should cost and when it's going to be available.
Well, if they're internal discussions, if they're private discussions, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. So long as there isn't communication to the press about things developing. In the meantime, you've got to be very, very careful about handling the press, as I all know. Being ahead of the curve, being involved in the press can really influence it and shape it positively. But yeah, at these very early stages, I agree that it's probably not the kind of discussion you would have publicly. But I don't think that doesn't mean you can't have it more privately.
I want to say that I completely agree that we shouldn't be creating any sort of impression of pressure or threats about offering things. Obviously, if in the press, you have a thing about a new possible procedure or treatment, the obvious question that will raise in people's minds is, well, when might this be available? I mean, it shouldn't be a threat or pressure, but just saying this looks at least 5 years away or something would be a fine response to that sort of press question. Isn't it an obvious question people will want to ask? Is how close is this to feasibility?
I think it is an obvious question, and I think I think there is this this analogy to cryonics that is weighing on people's minds about that. So Robert or whatever other company does this, I think needs to come up with a set of press responses to that damps down wild speculations and expectations.
By the way, Ken, do you know, I haven't read the stuff close enough to be sure, do you know whether this $10,000 figure, it seemed to be saying in some of the coverage that's what it was going to cost, even though clearly that's not the case, it was just a deposit. Do you know whether that was made clear by Nectome? I'm not sure how that came about, that misunderstanding.
Yeah, I think that was the most horrible idea that I've ever heard. In any case, it was certainly made clear. I asked Robert after the fact, what the heck is this $10,000 figure? It actually, in the MIT Technology Review article that sprang all the other articles, it made very clear that $10,000 was a essentially a marketing survey, like the type that Tesla Motors did, and that all that was is essentially give up $10,000. We're not going to touch it. It's completely refundable, but it shows that you have a sufficient amount of interest that we can go to investors and say, yes, there is a market for this. They shouldn't have called it a wait list. That doesn't make any sense. It's not what it is, so why call it a wait list? And $10,000 certainly can't buy anything in terms of a procedure like this. So it was just poorly done, and it was only essentially a marketing survey.
Okay, thank you. I see that somebody asked whether Alcor would be willing to work with a company that offered ASC as an option. So rather than offering it internally, to partner with someone in some way. That's kind of hard to answer without a lot more details. Again, we need to know what kind of skills will be needed for standby and for doing the procedure, how much that overlapped with what we did. And if we had an official linkage like that, is that really any better than doing it ourselves? I'm not too sure. So that's all the answer I can give to that one.
I mean, I for one am. Let me give you a little bit of an opinion that. So I look at Alcor, and I think Alcor is actually fantastic in terms of how much it's thought about doing this. You know, I really think that the best thing that could occur. Okay, so this is my dream team. This is my dream team. If Alcor and 21st Century Medicine and Robert got together and said, Alcor knows how to preserve people. You know, we know how to do the get to people in time and perfuse them and deal with all of that stuff. And we're an established company for doing this. 21st Century Medicine has all of that research know-how that made ASC possible in the first place. And and Robert is dead set on making ASC the best well-documented, scientifically proven way of preserving a brain. And if they got together and took several years and pushed that out into the medical community and the scientific community and just debated the heck out of it in terms of, this is what we want to do. We're following all the rules. The science is right, and there's people that want this to happen. So what are you guys waiting for? That would be my kind of dream team. I feel very worried that essentially there's a lot of resources that are being split because essentially maybe Robert really wants to not offer a product and not be associated with anybody that has offered a product and really wants to go through the publication and all this other stuff, and in order to do that he has to build up his own lab and his own resources and stuff and really replicate stuff that's already out there in the community. In any case, I know that this is probably not possible, but that's kind of the I realize that there are many. There's a tremendous amount of experience that Alcor has. There's a tremendous amount of experience that 21st Century Medicine has, and I feel like if those could have been brought to bear, or if they could still be, to make ASC happen, that would be fantastic. Again, I have nothing to do with Nectome or its policies, so I can only express my my feelings on this.
And Nectome is set up as a for-profit company, right? And it already has investors.
That's right. I believe that's the case. I believe that's the case.
So that's one thing that does concern me. I mean, apart from the public perception of that, people are always saying this is a scam, we're in it to make money, and it helps if we point out that we're a charitable tax-exempt organization. It's going to be more difficult with a profit-making organization. The other thing that concerns me is even if you don't need so much active maintenance with this procedure, you've still got to store people securely. You've still got to have an organization that's going to maintain people for the long term and who's going to revive them and rehabilitate them. And that requires the organization to survive for a long time. And of course, how long that is depends on your assumptions about whether there's going to be a singularity or not, when that will happen. But commercial organizations generally don't live very long. I looked at this and saw how many last for a century or longer, and it's hardly any. There's a few rare exceptions. It's generally non-profits and educational institutions and religious organizations that last a long time. So if someone were to offer this, if possible, I would like to see it done by the kind of organization we are, a 501c3 tax-exempt non-profit, if at all possible. That could be difficult because if you're just doing it, if you're just taking payment for a specific service, probably aren't going to get or maintain your charitable status. That's the problem with Cryonics UK, and that's one reason Alcor does charity cases and research and so on, because it helps to protect non-profit status. So the way Nectome is currently set up concerns me in terms of not just the public perception, but actual longevity and what they can actually reassure people about in terms of bringing them back eventually.
Well, I really agree with what you're saying. I think that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience that's within the Cryonics community, and I hope that that some of that can be transmitted to Robert and his company. I'm not sure if he'll listen, but I suspect he will, because he wants to have this succeed as well.
Can I ask a tough question? So what I'm hearing, apart from Ken and I guess from Robert, is that they want to go down this standard medical line of doing the standard process of doing demonstration, et cetera, till they finally get to the end of getting a medical acceptance from the medical community. The Cryonics community is off on the side and not entirely respected in that world. And the key question is, what can the rest of the Cryonics community do to help, other than just shut up and stop saying embarrassing things? I mean, is that the best thing we can do, or or give money and help? I mean, should we just not talk about it and associate with it because we're afraid of messing up the medical community's perception and willingness to accept this new line of development?
I think it's going to be a long, hard road before the medical community comes anywhere near this situation. And I think that this kind of stabilization is an ideal opportunity for a switch where we start to employ the funeral industry. About half of all suspensions now are done under extremely poor conditions, and they would be much better if the people were just loaded up with the aldehyde by a funeral director as soon as possible. I mean, we had exponential growth up until about the time that Robert Ettinger retired at Alcor. I mean, at CI. And this was sort of his idea. If you look at the recent issue of Long Life magazine, where he is reproduced, his early writing is reproduced, that's pretty much what he was saying. And that's basically what I was saying in my recent paper. There is no way to get cryonics to be a mass movement under the assumption that the medical establishment will jump on the train.
Well, I don't think that's true. I think it's a slow process, but we've already seen actually quite a lot of progress in the last 20 years. I know just from the way we deal with hospitals these days. 20 years ago, and they can tell you this, if you went into a hospital and said, we want to cryopreserve the patient, they'd say, "What the hell are you talking about? Get out of my hospital." Today, the common reaction is, "Oh yes, I've seen you guys on the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, or one of those science shows, and that's really fascinating. Can we watch? Maybe we can help." That's much more common, at least in Alcor's experience these days. Plus, you have things like the researcher, his name just slipped my brain, the guy who's doing 10 degrees C surgery. He's a professor at University of Arizona, Tucson. Anyway, he actually came to visit Alcor and was quoted in the press, and basically asked what he thought of what we were doing, even though he's doing above freezing temperature surgery research. He said, "Well, yeah, it's essentially the same principle. Cold slows things down. What Alcor is doing is much more radical, but it's not unreasonable." And he was actually very friendly to us. So I think, to go back to the earlier question, I think both cryonics people and ASC people, which is also partly cryonics, can certainly work together in the sense that any paper we can get published that shows good preservation of neural structure by either procedure is helpful to everybody. It's going to be helpful in the scientific profession. It would be helpful medically. It may be accepted by scientists before it is more generally by medicine, but at least we're not finding huge resistance generally by the medical profession. They don't try and interfere with us now. I mean, we've got ironclad contracts, we've used the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. It's pretty hard for them to interfere, but they're actually being fairly cooperative, at least in the United States, certainly more so than other countries.
Well, look, you're always going to find minor improvements here and there, and certain people who are responding favorably, but the growth is not there. There was exponential growth up until about the turn of the century, and now it's flat. And that's we got to go to become a mass movement. If we're going to succeed, we're not going to be a mass movement as long as we're waiting for the medical establishment to jump on the train. I mean, and you could also have, the funeral directors paying money to a company to be trained on how to do this. I mean, this could be self-financed if it was set up right, but as long as, we're going to try to keep this under the roof of the medical establishment, there's no chance it's going to become a mass movement. That's pretty obvious from the analysis of the data I did.
Well, but we get much better results if we have a standby and we could bring the procedure right away, rather than waiting for a funeral director to pick someone up and then pump them in with some chemicals. I think having a standby team there at the bedside is going to produce much better results, and we see that on the CT scans. The longer the delay,
most people do not have that. Most standby just don't work. CI has refused to even state anymore how many postmortems they have. Last figure that they gave out was that about half of all of them people coming in were postmortems. That means they're going through the funeral industry. If most people are going through the funeral industry, then we should be working with the funeral industry.
Well, I think that may be the case for CI, because just looking at the membership and the number of cases they do, most of their cases are probably last-minute cases, probably last-minute sign-ups. So that's not really the model that Alcor uses. So we generally, we were managing about 90% standby rate for several years. That's dropped quite a lot just recently, which doesn't seem to be for any particular reasons. Hopefully it's just statistical and we'll get back up there again, especially if we can get some good medical alert devices and vital signs monitors so we can get to people quickly. So it's, the two organizations may be quite different in that approach. CI has not really emphasized standby and has only really brought it in as an option through SA recently. But I think they do get a lot of last-minute cases. Just by the numbers, that must be the case. Unless they have a much older membership. It just doesn't add up otherwise.
Yeah, but I mean, when you look at the costs, you're not going to get a mass movement with standby. No, there's just not enough people out there to be paying, maybe $50,000 or have that much money ready to do a standby. The only way that we're ever going to see a mass movement is by using the infrastructure that's out there, and that means the funeral directors, and that means that we make the funeral directors pay to be upgraded. We sell them what they need to do the suspension or to get it started, and we eliminate all of the cooling that's necessary by just doing the fixation immediately and getting the person off. I mean, this could be cut. We could cut the costs, use the infrastructure that's out there, start getting enough people flowing into the system so we could actually have money to do serious research, which we do not have now.
Well, that's certainly going to push it further away from being accepted by the medical establishment, because it will then be seen as another form of interment, really. If it's associated with funeral directors, it's not going to be following the medical model, so that's going to further put off any acceptance by the medical mainstream.
I think that the acceptance by the population is what is important, and that is going to come by using the infrastructure that's there. You're simply just not going to get the medical establishment to come in. I think this just, unrealistic to take that idea seriously at this point, or even 10, 20 years down the road. I'm saying right now. Okay, right now.
Well, why do you think the medical community will not accept this? Maybe it's a completely obvious answer, but I want to hear it anyway.
Well, the medical community, according to what I found out when I wrote my paper, thinks that this is just a cult, a weird cult, and they don't want to be involved. I mean, the Society for Cryobiology still hasn't opened the door, have they?
That's not true. They no longer ban.
Excuse me. I'd like to speak up. I have members of my family and friends who are medical doctors on medical teams. I spoke to numerous surgeons. What you're saying is simply not plausible, and it's not factual. It's a random assumption based on a fear, and I'm not trying to discount what you're saying, because the American Medical Association may very well be opposed to cryonics, like the Federal Drug Administration is opposed to radical life extension generally. But medical doctors are aware of cryonics, and my brother, who's a conservative Christian, really supports cryonics and thinks the work that Alcor is doing is incredible. So I think we have to look at it not as one particular thing, as an umbrella, but the different fields within the medical community. For example, a internal medical person may not be as advanced as someone who does transplants or implants. So within the particular fields of the medical profession, we have to look at what fields and who are the most advanced based on the science and technology that they're using for their surgery, such as automation and robotics, etc.
And let me just give you some quick empirical feedback on the medical profession's approach to us. We just in the last couple of weeks we just invited ICU nurses from a local hospital to come to Alcor to take a tour and asked them if they would be interested in joining our local response team. And we've had about a dozen people come in so far, and they seem absolutely fascinated, and quite a few want to follow up on that. So that was not exactly a hostile reaction. So I'm really seeing an improving reaction, and I don't think it's unreasonable. Sometime, I don't know how long it's going to be, but I think at some point hospitals will have a cryopreservation wing where they start the procedure and probably then hand off the patient to a specialist organization at some point. I think with low temperature surgery becoming more common, with DARPA funding low temperatures to get soldiers off the battlefield and buy them time, with NASA funding hibernation research, and especially if in the next 10 years we see reversible organ cryopreservation, which looks pretty likely at this point, I think it's not difficult to see the medical profession opening up to this idea. It's not going to happen instantly, but just think back over the history of certain other changes. Some things happen very quickly. Anesthesia was very quickly accepted because there were very clear benefits on both sides, right? The doctor didn't have to hold down the patient screaming as they cut the leg off, and the patient didn't have to suffer the agony. But when it comes to anesthetic, antisepsis, it was quite the opposite. It's taken decades and decades and still is not done very well because you don't immediately see the effects of improving by washing your hands and so on. So initially this guy was saying there were visible particles floating through the air that carry disease, and people thought he was nuts. And then even after that was verified, it took a long time for that to catch on. So an idea as radical as cryonics is going to take a bit of time, but we are seeing that progress. We're seeing more and more positive treatment. We're seeing science shows do coverage of us. We're seeing good cooperation with hospitals. So we are moving in that direction, and I fear that associating with the fuel industry, so explicitly could actually put us backwards, because people are already trying to push us into this kind of view of a means of disposition of the dead, freezing dead people, and that's not what we're doing. We're acting as an extension of emergency medicine.
I'm not saying this should be taken up by any existing organization. I mean, I think it's very fine that Alcor and CI are doing stuff, to suspend people with the idea of reviving them, next year. That's fine. What I'm saying is that we need to hook into what is going on in the world. That what's going on in the world is that, the overwhelming majority of persons, 99.99%, are being placed in the hands of funeral directors an independent company could be set up to basically give them the materials they need to do a body washout and fix these people, and then get them into some kind of storage area where there could be a nonprofit actually doing that, or just a separate wing of one of the current companies like CI or Alcor. I mean, we are a very select group of people here talking, but I mean, if we do a survey or get a general look at the growth rates of cryonics, it's just not there. We're not growing exponentially. Okay, I mean, that was up until about the year 2000 when Bob retired. And at least at CI. I mean, we're just not seeing anything that looks like exponential growth, and we had that before. Okay, so we're doing something that's not working.
Well, a couple of points. Whether we have exponential growth or not, of course, depends very much on what time frame you're looking at. If you look just at the last few years, we are actually having literally exponential growth. It's low in terms of percentage numbers, but it's been growing again. And I think this year, we should be growing probably twice as fast as last year as we eliminate people with funding problems. But I'm not sure why you think if it was run through the fuel industry, you'd get a sudden rush of people, because I think the primary problem is not the cost at this point. It's, especially if you're talking about a procedure which is brain only, it's psychological. People don't want to think about this. They don't want to deal with it. They have all kinds of philosophical issues. They come up with all kinds of reasons that are ridiculous, like overpopulation and so on, or they're afraid of what their friends will think. That kind of thing is much stronger as a force stopping people signing up than the cost, in my experience. We have plenty of people who could afford it, and even say they're going to do it, and then they don't do it. So I'm not clear why going through the fuel industry, maybe costing a little bit less, is going to suddenly make this a popular idea. I don't think it will.
Well, look, in the last years that we have data for CI, it was doubling every 3 years, and that stopped. I mean, you cannot bring the cost down to compete with the funeral industry, even if you just do the brain with current kind of procedures. Okay.
But why did growth stop if prices didn't change?
Growth stopped because Robert Ettinger left the scene. What he said before he left the scene was not taken seriously. Okay, I mean, it was in the recent magazine, his piece was reprinted, and he clearly was saying in there that we had to go along this line that I'm talking about. I mean, basically, what's being done at CI right now is impeding growth. It is, it is undermining really what could be accomplished. I mean, we need a separate line that basically can be a profit-making entity dealing with the funeral industry, and maybe getting those people into a nonprofit facility at the end. But if we can make this profitable for the funeral directors, okay, then that starts to generate real money. And certainly accomplishing our overall objective would be better if we had thousands of people coming in the door every year instead of a few hundred.
Well, apart from funeral directors, there are other people who can act to maybe bring new people in. For instance, insurance agents. We've talked to a number of people. We're dealing with Raymond James right now, which has been around for a long time. Is a very solid company. They are, letting financial planners and attorneys and other people know about this as an option, because obviously it can bring in new business for them, both with insurance and with setting up trusts. So that's another way of reaching people who may not have thought of this before, and especially if it comes from a sound conservative financial institution, they may take that quite seriously. So if that's going to have an effect, that's another avenue. So I'm not against doing it that way, but again, I think we can grow faster than this. I think we will grow faster than this. I think we're going to do better this year. Currently we've had a record number of applicants. We've got more people in the application queue than ever. We're actually straining to get, well, I can tell you about this, straining to actually deal with the number of signups, and we're having to upgrade our IT systems to handle this. So we're still growing far too slowly for my liking. I'd like to see us growing double-digit rates, but I think think we are picking up again, and we can get there.
The only way we're going to go mainstream is by having pricing which is pretty damn near what is being paid right now. Let people, encounter the funeral directors. And there's no way any of the current procedures are going to do that. I mean, if you could have a bottle full of fixation material and wash somebody out with it, that could compete. But nothing we're talking about up at this point could come anywhere near. And when I did the analysis of the Badger data, income was one of the most important predictors of whether people were interested in signing up. I don't think that's changed.
David, it sounds like we have an existing set of cryonics providers, and then we have this new technology and some new organizations looking to do new things, and you're trying to offer a third option. But the third option you're proposing really isn't on the table in terms of funders or organizations or anybody actually ready to do it. I mean, it seems like our priority here should be to talk about this new ASC option and what will it be created by separate organizations through separate funding, et cetera? Or to what extent can it be integrated into the existing organizations, and to what extent should it be? That seems to me the most important question here, given this recent development.
Yeah, but I agree with you 100%. But I don't think that this line of development will go anywhere, different than where we are right now. Basically, my attempt to put forward what I've been saying right now was totally stamped out, and I was excommunicated from CI. The pioneers of the industry think they're in the medical profession, including most of the people who are listening right now. I'm saying, as long as that continues, the whole thing will be looked upon as a religious cult and not taken seriously. That's, basically the social science behind it. And so I am saying, yes, we need a totally different line if we're going to actually go from being a separatist to a mass movement. And the technology is there to do it. With the fixation, any funeral director could buy a few bottles of stuff and be ready to do it, make a profit, get us the body eventually into a nonprofit facility. I mean, if you're serious about growth, that's really the only option that I can see that's going to have a real impact and reverse the current trend, which is basically, straight line, nothing like an exponential takeoff that we.
So I would ask. Okay, so I mean, what quality of brain preservation are you talking about? And before you answer that, the thing that I have that I think is most damning, the most damning criticism of cryonics in general, ASC, whatever, is that the only real product is false hope, and people will buy false hope. You can. You could say, look, we're going to pump you full of formaldehyde and throw you in a jar, and you might have a chance of coming back in the future, so give us $10,000. And there probably would be a lot of people that would go for that. And the medical and scientific community would look at that and say, you're selling false hope. You should be shut down as charlatans. And so my question is, if there is a legitimate proposal there to say, have the funeral directors perfuse with embalming fluid, which is what they already do, and then store the body somewhere, then at the very least, there should be a bunch of studies that show what quality of brain preservation you're getting under those circumstances. And I suspect it would be really crappy. And you would be essentially selling false hope.
I mean, look, half of the bodies coming into CEI are people who are signed up by their families after they've died. So this would be better than what they're getting right now. Okay?
That's not a good argument.
Well, if it's not a good argument, but if getting something better than we have right now is not a good argument, then what we have right now is pretty awful, isn't it?
You said it.
Well, I'd just like to make the point. I'd like to make the point that if you're saying that, well, this is too expensive to ever be part of medical practice or to be widely accepted, you know, look up the cost of any major medical procedure like heart surgery or organ transplant. You'll find that it's several times the cost of a whole body cryopreservation at Alcor. And yet, oh, look, this is widely accepted. This is done everywhere. So I don't think it's a strong argument that unless we cut costs to the bone and offer something that's a low quality service, that this can't be accepted much more widely. I just don't think that is backed up by the evidence in other medical procedures.
No, that's not the argument I'm making. The argument I'm making is that trying to sell it as a medical procedure simply will not fly. When we're looking at a mass market. Okay, and if we get 10,000 people coming in every year, and each of those people is worth $1,000, that we can put into research, we're going to be way ahead from where we are right now.
Well, I for one hope that Max continues with his with Alcor's outreach to the medical community.
Yeah, we will definitely be doing that. In fact, we give presentations whenever we can. We've at the hospital just north of us, we've done 7 cases there. I think we've had the CEO and the head of nursing come to visit Alcor and say, "How can we help you?" We have current contacts with another major medical center in the Phoenix Scottsdale area, and again, we've got ICU nurses coming in. We're talking to the top senior officials there. So, by personally talking to these people and having them visit especially, it's very good to do this locally to begin with, because they can actually see this is a real place, and that makes actually a huge difference. I think building those bridges can be done. It takes time, it's labor intensive, but that is the way forward, and along with publishing research. So I'm not going to give up on that approach.
I'm not asking you to give up on this approach, but I'm saying that the fixation allows us to get a flow of people that could be put in storage, okay, that is vastly greater than what we have right now and could generate exponential growth, which we saw before the turn of the century. And doing something like that would make it much better for any medical approach later, okay, or even at the same time. I mean, I know my view is not very popular and is not acceptable to the crowd here, but if we want to see adoption, wide-scale adoption, we've got to work with the infrastructure that's out there, and that means the funeral directors, because that's where most bodies are ending up. So it's past my bedtime here in Copenhagen, so you people will have to consider my thoughts, but I have to go.
I'm sorry, was that was a question to Max?
I'm not sure how much there is to say. I think we've covered it pretty well. I'd like to just reiterate the point that I know Ken doesn't want to hear this discussion, but if there's any internal discussion of things like costs and comparative costs, you really have to do it realistically. You've got to look at the cost of having a standby team, what kind of skills they need, how much you have to pay these people, how long you have to do the standby, because we've done them for up to 3 weeks. You've got to think about storage costs. You have to think about, on the other end, how much is it going to cost to repair and revive somebody, even if there's an upload? And are you just going to reactivate them and then push them out the virtual door and say, good luck? Part of Alcor's mission is that money in the Patient Care Trust Fund is there also to help us to rehabilitate people. Imagine people now who come out of a coma after 20 or 30 years. It takes some time for them to get going. if it's a lot longer gap, either in time-wise or in terms of the amount of change, you can't just shove someone out the door. So you've got to consider those costs as well. You can't just look at the cost of some small slice of the total procedure. That's kind of a point I'd just like to re-emphasize.
Well, I agree completely. I just don't know what those costs are. I think the looking at what Alcor is doing currently, especially the intermediate temperature storage and standby costs and things like that, that's probably the best estimate for what ASC would cost.
Yep.
As you guys have thought deeply about all of these issues, and to a certain extent, ASC is just what I would like to think is a better way of preserving the connectome, but it is just a different way of preserving the connectome. So all of these other issues are mostly the same. That would be quite different if there was if room temperature storage was available, but as I've seen, there's nothing like that potentially even on the horizon. Nobody that I know of is working hard on that question, and the costs associated with. I mean, I think all of these costs. I think everybody can agree that all of these costs would come down substantially if more people were doing this. And until then, the cost is just going to be higher than any of us would like. Does that sound reasonable?
I wouldn't say that all the costs will come down substantially if we had a lot more members. I think some would, but basically, what it costs to do a standby is probably not going to come down because you still got to pay people with the right qualifications to do that for each case. So it doesn't matter how many cases you do. Now, for internal surgery work, then we currently pay our surgeons a fair bit of money for very little time. If we had enough cases, we could have a full-time surgeon or two on hand, and that would probably save us some money. There'll be some savings on the operations side because we definitely would achieve economies of scale. But in terms of the actual cryopreservations, I doubt that you'd really save a whole lot. I mean, if you're thinking in big terms, maybe you could eventually afford your own private jets and so on, and have them reasonably available, and that might save some money. But I think operations scales quite well. The actual cryopreservation procedure, not so much. Storage, maybe. Ralph Wilkel wrote this paper on what if you had millions and millions of people, and he had some schemes for vastly reducing the storage costs. So there's some possibilities there. There's difficult transitions in between. Although we're recently just moving to a new doer that will store more than twice as many whole body patients in the same space. So pushing those costs down. So there's some room for reducing costs of cases, but most of the benefits I think would be to the operational side.
So I mean, if this was adopted in widely in hospitals, then there would be no standby costs, right?
If it was covered by your medical insurance, sure, yeah, that would make a big difference.
Well, I'm not saying that. I guess I'm saying if the hospital that you were staying in anyway, which is of exorbitant costs, if a lot of people were doing cryopreservations at their end of life, that would the idea of having a dedicated standby team would disappear, right?
Well, no, because not everybody goes in the hospital.
Or it would be shared across many patients simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, there's still going to be cases where they're not dying in a hospital, so you'd still want the team to be able to get to the location. But yeah, to some extent. But again, one cost that I think, even if you have room temperature storage, you may think, okay, that's going to save a lot of money. We don't have to have liquid nitrogen and so on. But the fact is, you still have to have some funds put away for eventual repair, revival, rehabilitation, and the amount you'll need for that is kind of unknown. So, just for storing a brain, the patient care trust part of that is just $25,000. That's not that much for you have to assume fairly good growth for that to pay for revival, repair, rehabilitation anyway. So I don't think really cut back on that part of it very much.
So does Alcor? So what if I'm a little confused. So how much of the cost of Alcor is you may not be able to answer this question, but how much of the cost of an Alcor procedure is dedicated to the storage and the preservation, et cetera, and how much is dedicated to this this patient fund for revival? Because if I'm for example, if I'm somebody who is idealistic, which I think I've proven that I am an unrealistic person, and I think that the future is going to be reviving people because they want to revive people, and there's not going to necessarily need to be any economic incentive for that particular person to be revived, then am I unable to cut those costs off of my Alcor preservation?
Well, there aren't two separate funds for maintaining somebody versus reviving them. They're all the same fund. The Patient Care Trust Fund is there to maintain someone for as long as it takes. And if we're doing it right, if we're investing that well, then that money should grow over time. And then at the end, when you've got enough money, you can use that to pay for the repair, revival, rehabilitation. So those are not two distinct funds. Although you can make them distinct in the sense that there are mechanisms now. Linda's been working with trusted entities to develop low-cost options for personal future income trusts, where basically you can put money aside so you can get your resources back in the future, and that could pay for revival, that could repair for whatever costs of living there are in the future. But that's not part of the Patient Care Trust Fund, because that's a collective pool given a non-profit nature. So again, there's no separation between maintenance and revival pools of money. That's all one right now. So you still have to, unless you really think people will do it for free in the future, which is possible, but I wouldn't want to bet on that. You're still going to need some kind of funding available that's going to grow over time and pay for your revival and perhaps rehabilitation. Even uploads will need rehabilitating. They'll have to figure out how things work and how to interact with people in modern society and so
on. I'm just wondering how you calculate revival costs and rehabilitation costs, because I wouldn't know the first way to calculate such a thing. I mean,
no, we don't. We don't. What we calculate is how much it would cost to keep someone stored indefinitely, and that's kind of the base. That's a conservative amount. So we can never sell more than 2% a year of the investments. That's a pretty safe strategy. We should be able to then grow that over time. And so, if for instance it takes 100 years, and so you're probably more optimistic than that. Some people less optimistic. But let's just say it takes 100 years. Let's say that with a reasonably conservative investment approach, that's half very safe and half more growth oriented. Given the long-term return of the stock market, it's not unreasonable to think you get a 3% real return. Well, it means your money's going to double about every 24 years. So in 100 years or 96 years, whatever, you're going to have 16 times the money you started with. So that would be quite a bit available to pay for those costs at the end. But we don't know what the cost would be. We have no idea.
I see. I see what you're saying. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I recently had a discussion with one of the directors, and I suggested that one way revival costs could be kept down would be by bringing someone, even a biological scenario, bringing someone back to consciousness and then saying, can we rehabilitate you in virtual reality, because it'll be a lot less expensive. We'll be paying for your food and shelter and so on and so on. I think he rather misunderstood that. He watched too many episodes of Black Mirror and thought he'd be imprisoned without any control over his environment. That's of course not what I was suggesting. But I think you could do a lot of the rehabilitation virtually before you let someone out into the physical world, even in the biological scenario. But I'd rather plan for there being some costs rather than assuming it'll be free. Well, I think we may have covered pretty much everything, unless people have other aspects to bring up.
Yeah, as I put in the text, you should ask Nectome. I know what I think their research milestones should be, uh, and it looks like from my reading of their website that their research milestones are to develop develop a medical procedure for ASC. So ASC was only done in a laboratory setting on laboratory animals. There are a host of questions that they would run into in actual procedures, the type of which Alcor has a ton of experience with, and I think given the nature of ASC, given the idea that they could do a ton of experiments on pigs, for example, that address concerns about blockages of blood flow and storage questions. Uh, what is the best procedure for applying this post-mortem? These are questions that Alcor has addressed, but has addressed in not in an ASC type of a context. And so I think that's what Nectome is considering. At least I hope that's what Nectome would be considering, because if they're saying that they're going to at some point offer this procedure, the medical community would want to know exactly what procedure they're actually going to offer, and that they would want to know exactly what quality controls they have for that procedure.
By the way, one way in which I think cryonics organizations could work together with people wanting to offer ASC is in the area of elective, whatever you want to call it. We don't have a good term for it because it's not really dying, but elective early termination of vital signs, shall we say. That's something that really you can't do except in a very limited way in the US. You can do it more in Switzerland. That obviously is the best way to do it. Even currently, again, there are the limits to what you can do. There's only a few states in which you can do this. You have to be within 6 months of dying, which is not great if you have dementia or Alzheimer's or brain cancer or just generally miserable. If you could just choose to go somewhat earlier and under more optimal conditions when you have a team standing by, whether it's for vitrification, whether it's for ASC, that would be vastly better. You could time it perfectly, make sure there are no problems with logistics and travel times, no interference, and that'd be the optimal circumstances. So I think that's a place where we have common cause, and of course it's very tricky politically. And I think we are, at least in the Western world, moving towards that bit by bit, very slowly. But that's definitely a place where we'd have common cause. I think, first of all, working out how to do it with the current laws as well as possible, and then hopefully extending beyond that. And I'd just like to make the point that, contrary to what David was saying, cryonics could actually become a way of saving society's money, because, as it's pretty well known, the vast amount of medical expenses are incurred really in the last few months or last year of life. But what if people had the option of going a little bit earlier, saving themselves or their families vast amounts of money that could actually far more than pay for one of these procedures? And it might even be something that governments would then sponsor to save money economically, or insurance companies would give you some benefit for it. So, or families wouldn't be ruined by having the funds drained by a member of the family trying to survive a few more weeks desperately for no real reason. So I think we have some areas there, practical issues we can work together on, as well as in publishing papers showing good brain preservation. Yeah, Robin, I've seen different numbers. I don't know. I know McKinsey had a much higher percentage than 10%. I'm not really sure. I have to dig up some good sources on that. But it's quite a lot anyway. I mean, just look at the cost of an emergency room for a day. That's pretty significant. It doesn't take many of those to add up to the cost of the cryopreservation. Yeah. I just, if nobody has anything to say, I'll just add briefly that another common cause we would have, and I'm not sure when we'd be able to even have a chance of doing this, would be to get the rights status of people who are cryopreserved or chemically preserved or however they're done. We need to have them accepted as being as having rights, as not being dead people. They're not living, but they're not dead. They're in an immediate status, just like someone in a coma. You can't just decide to chop them into pieces or use them for some purpose like that. They do have some rights. So obviously we'd have common cause in that area as well. And that might seem like it's not going to happen for half a century or so. On the other hand, you look at how rapidly we've seen pushes for rights in the area of gay rights and transgender and so on, and that's happened remarkably fast. So who's to say how long before that becomes a reasonable possibility?
I'm very heartened to hear you say that. I'm glad that that I'm not the only idealist here that believes that the world can change.
I'm a realistic idealist. I'm a dynamic optimist. We've got to make it change.